This is your lecture on Carolingian art. This is a period that most of us didn't even study in high school, so just a little background. Carolingian refers to Charlemagne. He was the king of the Franks from the year 768, but then he names himself the Holy Roman Emperor from the year 800 until his death in the year 814. So the Holy Roman Empire, the one that survives up to Napoleon, it begins with Charlemagne and being crowned emperor in Rome by the Pope. However, he is a guy who likes hunting, and so what he does is permanently establish his court not in France but in Aachen. Aachen is up here, middle of nowhere Germany, because he likes to hunt and there's lots of good hunting there. His motto for himself is Renovatio Imperii Romani, which means the revival of the ancient imperial Rome. He sees himself as the heir to the Roman Empire, and he wants to revive that glory as a Christian empire, using Constantine and Justinian as his models. He really is interested in ancient culture and classical style, and so that's what we're really going to be paying attention to in here, the ways that he is intentionally commissioning artworks and architecture that echo ancient Rome. Case in point, this equestrian portrait. So it might be of Charlemagne, it might be of his grandson Charles the Bald, but this equestrian, this small solid bronze equestrian portrait, is very similar to the way Marcus Aurelius is portrayed, for example. So even in the way he's styling himself and in how his heirs are styling themselves, they're imitating these strategies established by ancient Roman emperors. You can even see this tendency within the illuminated manuscripts that they commission. So this is a page from the Coronation Gospels. They're called the Coronation Gospels because they were found supposedly on Charlemagne's body. So Otto III excavates him in the year 1000, and they found this book supposedly resting on his lap. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a good story. It's interesting too because you can see that they dyed the vellum purple, and purple being the imperial color. But what's interesting about this, it's another page with St. Matthew writing out his gospel. It should look very familiar, but look at the style in which he's painted. It's very similar to this one that was in an Italian library. And so you can see that the color, the way he's modeled with color, this looks closer to us because it is white as opposed to what we see over here, which is in a darker color. So this reliance upon color rather than line is really important. Very different from the other example that we looked at in the insular lecture. So here there's pretty much no modeling whatsoever. All of the colors are very flat with few exceptions. Whereas here you see that there's a great interest in varying the color and all of the different tones in order to give the Matthew over here a more three-dimensional appearance. However, in different contexts, you see a really different stylistic strategy. So this is also from the Carolingian period, but it was not commissioned expressly for imperial use. This is from the Ebo Gospels, which is from the monastery at Reims. The person who commissioned this is Ebo, and he used to be Charlemagne's librarian, but after Charlemagne dies, he becomes the abbot of this monastery. This one has that same reliance upon lines that we saw before, right? And you wonder, why are they going to do these such different styles? I think it has to do with the people who would be using it, namely monks. I think monks would have found a lot to relate to in the energy of this Matthew and the way that the lines seem to be flowing off of the page here. He's so excited. He's like having a vision, and that is what he's pouring onto the page. Another thing we have a lot of from this period are these absolutely fantastic manuscript covers. So manuscripts were often placed within ornamental covers like this. This is something that would process down the aisle in church during the Mass. And so the fact that it's shiny and really attention grabbing would be important in terms of how it functions within the performance of the Mass. They also, of course, protected the book that was inside it. So this, as you look at it, at first I find it to be kind of overwhelming. It's like jewels everywhere. But then the more you look at it, the more you can see it's very geometrically laid out in this grid pattern with these different panels. And then even as you look at the jewels, you'll see that there's a symmetry across the cover in the way that they're laid out. I find these to be fascinating because they're so three-dimensional. Like if you look at this, it has this almost architectural quality. Some people compare these to heavenly Jerusalem, which in the book of Revelation is described as being having walls of gold and gems. So it could be a very literal representation of what heavenly Jerusalem would be. I mean, as you go in even further, you can see, I mean, this looks like a weird beetle. I mean, these covers are just magnificent, very heavy, and remarkable ways to, again, think about how sacred the text is within it and what are ways in which these monasteries and priests are trying to emphasize the sacred and precious nature of the text. So now let's talk about architecture. So in Aachen, Charlemagne builds a palace complex that I think is quite comparable to the forum that you would see in ancient Rome. So the Forum of Trajan, for example. Notice that there's this open space. This is a model of it because it doesn't exist in the same way anymore. So here we've got a forum with an arcade. Over here is a basilica. And then here is a church. This is what we're going to look at closely, this church right here. So it's called the Palace Chapel of Charlemagne. It's small but centrally planned around an octagon. This should sound familiar, right? It's very similar to San Vitale in Ravenna, and that's on purpose. So again, he's imitating ancient Roman and early Byzantine emperors. So in making a centrally planned church in a way that looks so similar to Ravenna is definitely a shout out to Justinian. And if you look at the interior, it's very similar too. So there's 2 stories with an arcade going around. The thing that's interesting about Charlemagne's is he included a special seat for himself. It's right there. So here it is from the side, big old throne of Charlemagne. And this is directly below an image of Christ making the sign of blessing. So similar to that Barberini ivory that we looked at in the Byzantine period, there is a literal alignment between the divine and Charlemagne, who'd be sitting right there. Some more architecture. This is a period in which a lot of monasteries are built. Monasteries are self-sufficient religious communities, usually ruled by an abbot or an abbess. This is actually the oldest architectural plan in existence that we're looking at here. It's from circa 817. It's called the St. Gall Plan. However, it was never actually built. This was more of an intellectual pursuit as if to answer what would the perfect monastery look like. Now, it's kind of hard to read like this. So this is a schematized version of it that is more legible. And I want you to look at the different parts that you see here. It is an entirely self-sufficient community. If you look over here, they have the horses, making barrels, brewery, bakery, mills, mortars, a kiln, an infirmary, physicians, bloodletting, because you know you need that, the dormitory, latrines, everything is completely self-sufficient here because the monks wanted to be able to sustain themselves. However, they did serve the communities in some ways, and so if you look at the perimeter of the space, you have buildings that are important for community use. So school for educating the local population, a guest house, kitchen, maybe a hostel, places where the servants could stay, and then here the entry to the church itself. This is a drawing of what it might have looked like if it had ever been built, and it has an incredible geometric order to it, right? Very regular, and that's because it's built using a modular system. A module is a basic unit of which the dimensions of the major parts of a work are multiples. So here they basically come up with a unit of measurement and then they multiply it to create all the space. If you look in the church, it's easy to see that. The module within the church is the crossing here. So you can see that reflected here and then again. So the entire church is made up of multiples of that square. Within the rest of the monastery, the module is actually the size of a bed of a monk, which is kind of beautiful, right? To think that the entire monastery would be based on the measure of the men who would inhabit it. So one more thing to talk about with the plan of this church, it's a basilica, right? It is very similar to Roman basilicas, even more so than what we saw in St. Peter's, because they actually make the apse on both ends, similar to what you have in the Basilica Olpia. So you got apses on both sides. The entrance would be here. And then you have these towers on the western end of it. So in these churches, the altar is always placed at the east end to face Jerusalem. And then on the western end, beginning in this period, you have a structure that's called a westwork. Here is the westwork of the Abbey Church of Corvey. Most of these churches don't survive. We have very few examples of Carolingian westworks, but this is one of them. And if you look at it, if you didn't know this was a church, it kind of looks like a giant fortress, right? It's very imposing and threatening. And it transforms the nature of this building. It doesn't necessarily look welcoming. Anyway, so this westwork is an important precedent for the architecture that we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester, and so that's why I'm going to end with it. Anyway, thanks so much.